Tonight, we step into a story the textbooks won't tell, a chapter of faith that was rewritten before the ink could dry. A gathering of men in a distant city reshaped belief, erased voices, and decided what millions would be allowed to remember. For centuries, the Council of Nicaea has been remembered as a moment of unity, a triumph of truth. But behind the official story lies a trail of questions left unanswered, texts sidelined, and leaders whose authority was enforced by exile, threat, and silence. This isn't just about creeds or church politics. It's about power carved into doctrine, ideas buried because they could not be controlled, and the voices of those who dared to speak differently quietly erased from history. From secret scrolls to forbidden teachings, the early Christian world was more diverse, more vibrant, and far more contested than anyone was allowed to know. And the consequences of that council are still felt in what we read, what we are taught, and what we accept as truth. So before you accept the story as complete, ask yourself, what if the path of faith was chosen for reasons beyond holiness? What if the truth was curated, censored, and confined to the margins of memory? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step beyond the creed and uncover the history that was never meant to be remembered. The night is silent, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the whispers of forgotten voices carried across centuries. They speak of a meeting, not just any meeting, but one that changed the very shape of the world you know. A gathering of men in flowing robes, lit by candlelight, summoned by an emperor who dreamed of binding both throne and heaven under one law. They say that on this night, history itself bent like molten metal under the hammer of power. But what if I told you that this moment, celebrated as holy, was also the moment when silence became the loudest voice of all, the Council of Nicaea? It sounds harmless, like just another line in a dusty textbook, a date you memorize for an exam and quickly forget. But imagine stepping back into the year 325, into a Roman Empire wounded, fractured, and bleeding from both outside enemies and inside disputes. The Emperor Constantine knows that without unity the empire will collapse, and unity requires not just laws and armies, but a single faith, a single truth that all must follow. This is where the story begins, where belief was not only defined but controlled. Picture bishops and priests arriving from every corner of the empire, scarred by years of persecution, carrying manuscripts, arguments, and fears. Some believe Jesus was eternal, others claim he was created, and many hold on to texts that today you have never seen or heard of. These voices clash beneath vaulted ceilings, their words echoing like thunder in a storm, until the emperor himself appears, dressed not in holy robes but in the shining armor of a soldier. He is not a saint, he is a ruler, and the fate of Christianity now rests not on a prophet's words, but on the will of a man who craves power over eternity. For the first time, Christianity is no longer the fragile faith of the persecuted. It is the chosen faith of an empire. But what happens when power takes hold of belief? What happens when debates over God's nature are settled not by visionaries or seekers, but by imperial decree? What happens when entire gospels are whispered about one day and burned or hidden the next? The Council of Nicaea was not only about theology, it was about control, about drawing a sharp line between what was allowed to exist and what had to vanish. The decisions made in that hall would ripple outward for centuries, reshaping which texts you can read, which names you know, and which truths you will never hear. And behind it all lurks the most haunting question. If the truth is eternal, why would anyone need to silence other voices? The whispers that began in that chamber have never truly faded. They linger in lost manuscripts, in apocryphal gospels buried beneath the sands of Egypt, in contradictions inside the Bible itself. They ask you to wonder whether the faith that emerged was chosen by God or edited by men. A single council, a single night, a single decision, and an entire future locked into place. Tonight you stand at the threshold of that silence, Beyond it lies the forbidden history of Christianity, the story of how power rewrote faith and how memory itself was sealed away. The empire that Constantine inherited was not a shining jewel of stability, but a fractured realm trembling on the edge of ruin. Rome, once the mighty conqueror of the world, had become a wounded beast. Its borders were battered by invading tribes, its treasury drained by endless wars, and its people divided by loyalty to different rulers. The empire itself had even been split into pieces, ruled by multiple emperors, each clawing for dominance. Constantine rose in this storm, a man of ambition and vision, who understood that survival meant more than just swords and armies. It meant uniting hearts and minds under one banner, but unity was not simple. Religion, in the early 4th century, was not a neat arrangement of temples and priests. Pagan cults still thrived, worshipping the old gods of Rome. Meanwhile, Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had spread like wildfire across provinces, gaining strength despite the blood spilled in arenas. Yet Christianity itself was divided. Different communities told different stories about who Jesus was, what he taught, and how believers should live. Some claimed he was fully divine from the beginning, others that he was created later by the Father. Some read Gospels you have never heard of, words of wisdom that today lie buried in desert caves. To Constantine, these disagreements were not just religious arguments. They were cracks in the foundation of his empire. Constantine was a soldier before he was a saint. He had marched with legions, smelled the iron and blood of the battlefield, and seen how loyalty could shatter when divided by belief. When he marched into battle at the Milvian Bridge in the year 312, he claimed to see a vision in the sky, a shining cross with the words, "By this sign conquer." Whether miracle or strategy, Constantine seized it as the symbol of his rule. He painted crosses on his soldiers' shields, won the battle, and declared that his empire would march with the God of the Christians. It was not faith alone that drove him, but the need for a unifying force stronger than the old gods. Still, he faced a problem. Christianity was not one, but many. How could he demand loyalty to a faith that was at war with itself? His empire was already a fragile mosaic of cultures and languages, stretched thin across continents. Without a single creed, without a clear definition of belief, the Christian movement risked tearing itself apart, and with it, Constantine's fragile hold on power. Unity was survival. Disunity was collapse. And so for Constantine, faith was not merely a path to heaven, it was policy, an instrument of empire. Imagine the weight of his decision. On one side, ancient Rome with its gods, temples, and crumbling traditions. On the other side, a new faith rising from the ashes of persecution, promising eternal life but entangled in bitter disputes. Constantine stood at a crossroads, not just for himself, but for the entire Western world. Every choice he made would ripple through centuries, shaping not only the empire he ruled, but the very foundation of the religion billions would one day call their own. In that moment, Rome's survival and Christianity's future became bound together by the will of one man. Long before the word creed was hammered into stone, Christianity was not a single voice but a chorus of many. If you had stepped into the bustling streets of Antioch or Alexandria in the 2nd or 3rd century, you would not have found one Christianity but dozens. Each community told its own story of who Jesus was, what he taught, and what his life meant for the world. Some believed he was divine from birth, others insisted he became divine only after his baptism. Some thought he was human, clothed in spirit, while others whispered that he was a heavenly being who only seemed to wear flesh. The diversity was not an accident, it was the starting point. The Gnostics told of hidden knowledge, a secret wisdom passed down from teacher to student. They described a universe far stranger than what most bishops preached, a world where light and darkness were locked in cosmic battle, and where salvation came not through obedience, but through awakening. Their Gospels painted Jesus as a revealer of mysteries, a voice urging seekers to discover the divine spark hidden within themselves. For them, faith was not about kneeling before authority, but about opening your eyes to a deeper truth. Then came the Marcionites, followers of a bold teacher named Marcion, who could not accept that the wrathful God of the Old Testament was the same as the Father preached by Jesus. To Marcion, the God of love and mercy was a new revelation, separate from the ancient law of Israel. He built his own canon of Scripture, rejecting what did not fit. His followers gathered around a slim collection of texts, believing they had purified the faith. To Orthodox leaders, Marcion was a heretic. To his own people, he was the one who preserved the true message. And then there were the Arians, who rose to prominence in the early 4th century. Their leader, Arius, declared that the Son was not eternal, but created by the Father before time began. To many, this teaching made sense. It preserved the absolute supremacy of the Father, while still granting divinity to the Son. Yet to others, it struck at the very heart of salvation. If Jesus was not fully God, how could he bridge the gap between heaven and earth? The argument over this single idea would one day summon emperors and bishops into heated councils. But in its beginning, it was only one more voice in the storm of beliefs. Everywhere you looked in the early church, debates burned. Some believers used the Gospel of Mary, where a woman was portrayed as a disciple equal to the men. Others clung to the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings that read more like riddles than history. In one city, Christians might meet in small houses to break bread and share visions. In another, they might gather in public halls with rituals that looked different from anything you would recognize today. There was no single path, no single authority, only a living, breathing faith still searching for its shape. When later leaders called these voices heresies, they erased the memory of just how wide the spectrum once was. Christianity did not begin as one clear note. It began as a chorus, loud, messy, and full of competing melodies. Only later would one voice rise above the rest, not because it was the only truth, but because it was the truth that power chose to preserve. The story of Constantine cannot be told without the vision that changed not only his life, but the course of history. It was the year 312. Rome was split by civil war, and the road to power was soaked with blood. Constantine marched toward the Milvian Bridge, preparing to face his rival Maxentius in a battle that would decide who ruled the empire. As legend tells it, on the night before the clash, he looked up into the sky and saw something no soldier could ignore. A cross of light appeared above the setting sun, and beneath it were words that would echo across centuries. By this sign, conquer. For a man who had spent his life in the chaos of battle, this was no ordinary omen. Constantine was not a priest or a prophet. He was a hardened general. Yet, this vision carved itself into his mind with the weight of destiny. He ordered his soldiers to paint the strange sign on their shields. When dawn broke, his legions carried not only swords and spears, but the symbol of a faith still persecuted only a few years earlier. The battle was fierce, but Constantine's forces crushed Maxentius. As the defeated emperor drowned in the river, Constantine rose as master of Rome, holding not just political victory, but what he claimed was divine approval. From that moment on, the empire itself began to change. Constantine was not baptized yet. He was not even a lifelong Christian. But he understood something vital. Religion was not only about gods and rituals. It was about loyalty. It was about uniting a fractured people under one vision, one symbol, one empire. The cross he had seen in the sky became more than a personal sign. It became a political blueprint. Imagine the power of this moment. A symbol once feared by Roman rulers, once carved into the skin of martyrs, was now painted on banners that marched at the head of armies. Christianity went from outlawed to celebrated almost overnight. For Constantine, This was not a quiet conversion of the heart. It was a strategy. If soldiers could fight under the sign of Christ, then citizens could rally under it too. The empire that had once crucified believers now embraced their God, but not out of compassion, out of necessity. This vision marked the birth of a new alliance. Church and throne began to weave together, threads that would not be easily pulled apart. Bishops gained influence, not only as spiritual leaders, but as political figures. Constantine built churches with imperial funds, gave privileges to clergy, and reshaped the laws of Rome to reflect Christian values. Yet behind every act was the shadow of that battlefield omen. By this sign, conquer. It was not only about salvation of the soul, it was about the survival of an empire. In that single vision, the future of both faith and empire shifted. Constantine had found a weapon greater than any sword. He had discovered the power of belief as a tool of rule. And from that day on, the cross was no longer just a symbol of sacrifice. It was a banner of empire, forever binding heaven to the politics of earth. The year was 325, and the Roman Empire stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. Constantine, newly crowned master of Rome, had set his eyes on something greater than victory in war. He wanted victory over chaos itself. To him, unity was survival, and Christianity, with its growing numbers and passionate followers, was the key. But Christianity was not one voice. It was a storm of voices, each claiming to know the truth. So Constantine issued a call that echoed across provinces and seas. Couriers on horseback carried his command. Every bishop, every leader of the church, was to gather in the city of Nicaea. They were to settle their disputes once and for all under the watchful eye of the emperor. And so they came. More than 300 bishops arrived, limping, riding, or carried by their followers. They came from distant deserts, from crowded port cities, from mountain villages, each bringing with them their own scriptures, traditions, and arguments. Many bore scars from the last wave of persecution, when Roman emperors still tried to crush the faith. Some had been imprisoned, others had lost family, others carried memories of friends burned alive. These were not men of comfort. They were survivors, hardened by suffering, yet now summoned by an emperor who once represented the very power that had tried to destroy them. Imagine the scene: streets filled with priests and scribes, scrolls carried in satchels, debates breaking out even before the council had begun. In inns and courtyards they argued late into the night, voices rising and falling over the nature of Christ, over which gospels should be read, over how the church should govern itself. To some, this gathering was the chance to preserve the purity of the faith. To others, it was an opportunity to push their ideas into the heart of the empire. And to all, it was a dangerous game, for whichever side lost might find itself silenced forever. When the council finally opened, Constantine himself appeared, dressed not as a priest, but as a ruler. He greeted the bishops with respect, but also with authority. This was not a free debate. This was an imperial assembly. The bishops sat in rows, scrolls unrolled, voices trembling with passion. Some argued that the Son was eternal, others that he was created. Some clung to texts now lost to history. Others demanded a single canon, clear and unquestionable. Every word spoken carried the weight of the empire, for Constantine was watching and his scribes were recording. The council was not merely about faith, it was about power. Each bishop represented not just his own beliefs, but the community behind him. Each decision risked dividing the empire further or binding it together. Alliances formed, tempers flared, and the air grew heavy with the scent of wax and sweat. Beneath the sacred chants and prayers, there was fear of being labelled a heretic, fear of exile, fear of vanishing from memory if the wrong words were chosen. The gathering of bishops in Nicaea was more than a meeting. It was the stage where the future of Christianity was scripted, not by prophets, but by men with scrolls and scars, guided by an emperor who demanded unity. From that gathering would rise a creed that still echoes in churches today. But with it also began the long silence over the voices that were not chosen, voices that would be buried, banned, or forgotten. In the crowded hall of Nicaea, the air trembled with tension. The empire itself seemed to hang on the edge of a single question. Was the Son created, or was he eternal? At the heart of this storm stood two men whose names would echo across centuries. Arius, a priest from Alexandria, thin, sharp, tongued, and fearless in his logic, and Athanasius, younger, fiery, relentless, who would one day become bishop and the most unyielding defender of what would be called orthodoxy. Their clash was not just an argument over theology, it was a fault line that threatened to split an empire. Arius taught that the Son of God, though exalted above all creation, was still created by the Father. To him this preserved the absolute majesty of God. If the Father was eternal, then the Son, no matter how glorious, had a beginning. Arius argued his case with precision, quoting scripture, reasoning through philosophy, and singing hymns that spread his teaching even to dock workers and soldiers. His followers chanted that there was a time when the Son was not, a phrase simple enough to repeat, but dangerous enough to unsettle the unity Constantine demanded. Against him rose Athanasius, fierce and uncompromising. He argued that if the Son were not eternal, then salvation itself was impossible. Only one who was fully God could bridge the chasm between heaven and humanity. For Athanasius, the Son was not a creation, but of the same essence as the Father. The Greek word he clung to was homoousios, meaning of one substance. A single word became the battlefield. To side with Arius was to see the Son as lesser, though divine. To side with Athanasius was to declare that the Son was co-eternal, equal in divinity to the Father. The council raged with debates. Some bishops supported Arius, fearing that Athanasius blurred the line between Father and Son. Others sided with Athanasius, unwilling to accept a Christ who was not fully God. Voices rose, fists slammed onto tables, and the emperor listened, his patience stretched thin. Constantine wanted peace, but peace required agreement, and agreement seemed impossible when a single word could decide the fate of faith. Imagine the weight of that word. In Greek, it was only a handful of letters, but within it lived centuries of prayer, sacrifice, and blood. To declare homoousios was to bind the Son and Father together in eternity. To reject it was to risk exile, condemnation, and the erasure of your name from history. Bishops who had once survived Roman prisons now faced the threat of being cast out by their own brothers. The unity Constantine demanded was being forged not through harmony but through fire. In the end, Arius would lose the vote, but the debate never died. His ideas lingered in secret, whispered in churches, carried by exiled bishops, and even embraced by future emperors. Athanasius would stand victorious at Nicaea, but his life would be marked by exile after exile as the empire swayed back and forth. The question of whether the Son was created or co-eternal was never simply answered. It was buried under the weight of imperial decrees and creeds recited in unison. Yet the fault line remained, a reminder that sometimes the fiercest battles in history are fought not with swords, but with words. The hall glowed with the dim flicker of candles, their light bouncing off marble walls and polished armour. Bishops sat in rows, scrolls unrolled before them, their faces drawn from days of debate and sleepless nights. Constantine's presence loomed over them, not as a silent observer, but as a ruler who expected resolution. The empire could not wait for endless arguments. The bishops were pressed to shape one voice, one declaration, one creed that would silence division. What they created in that room was more than words. It was a formula of belief that would outlive them all. The Nicene Creed did not fall from heaven like a sacred text. It was hammered together line by line, each phrase weighed for meaning, each word chosen with the precision of a blade. The central statement declared that Jesus Christ was not merely created, not merely close to God, but of the same essence as the Father, homoousios. That word became the hinge on which the creed turned. By affirming it, the bishops bound the Son eternally to the Father, making him fully divine and fully equal. The arguments of Arius were branded as heresy, and his followers were cast out. But the creed did more than settle theology. It became a weapon. For those who stood within its boundaries, it offered the shield of orthodoxy. Reciting its lines meant belonging, safety, and unity under the empire. For those outside, it was a sword, sharp and merciless. To deny the creed was to deny the empire itself, and with that denial came exile, silence, and sometimes death. A prayer that sounded simple in its rhythm was in truth a political act. When voices repeated it in churches, they were not only worshipping, they were swearing loyalty to a version of faith approved by power. Imagine the moment when the creed was first spoken aloud by hundreds of bishops, their voices echoing in unison. The hall, that had been filled with clashing arguments, now rang with a single declaration. To Constantine, this was victory. To the bishops who agreed, it was triumph. Yet to those forced to sign against their will or face exile, it was submission. The creed was unity, but unity achieved by drawing a line in the sand and daring anyone to cross it. Outside the council walls, ordinary believers did not yet know the storm that had been decided for them. In villages and cities across the empire, Christians gathered in homes, many still clinging to the Gospels and teachings they had always known. Soon they would be told that there was only one correct way to believe, and it was written in the words forged at Nicaea. Those who questioned would be accused of heresy. Those who resisted would vanish from the official record. The creed ensured not only what people believed, but also what they would forget. The Nicene Creed became both a shield of protection and a sword of control. It promised truth, but it also enforced silence. It shaped Christianity into a single voice, recited week after week, century after century, until the echoes drowned out all others. What began as a fragile chorus of beliefs was now bound into one song, and that song was chosen not by prophets, but by men in a candlelit hall under the gaze of an emperor. When people hear of the Council of Nicaea, they imagine fiery debates about the nature of Christ, bishops clashing over words that would shape the faith for centuries. But hidden beneath those famous arguments lay another layer of decisions, quiet yet powerful, that rarely find their way into sermons or textbooks. These were the canons, the rules and regulations, drafted by bishops who knew that faith was not only about belief but about control. They may not be quoted in church today, but they shaped the machinery of Christianity just as much as the creed itself. In that hall where theology was hammered out, the bishops also turned their minds to order. Who held authority in the church? Who decided disputes between local leaders? Who controlled the appointment of bishops in cities that were becoming the new spiritual capitals of the empire? These questions might seem dry, but they carried enormous weight. To decide them was to decide the future hierarchy of Christianity, to shift it from scattered communities into a system with chains of command. It was no longer just about personal faith. It was about who was allowed to speak for God and who was not. Among these decisions was one that touched every Christian then and still touches every Christian now, the date of Easter. Before Nicaea, believers celebrated the resurrection on different days depending on their local traditions. Some followed the Jewish calendar, tying it to Passover. Others observed it on Sundays of their own choosing. Constantine wanted none of this division. The empire could not tolerate a festival that fractured its people. So the council fixed the date of Easter into a unified celebration. From then on, the resurrection was no longer only a matter of remembrance. It was tied to the empire's calendar, stamped with imperial authority. Time itself was pulled under the power of the church and throne. Imagine sitting in that chamber as these decisions were passed. To the bishops, they were cloaking administration in the language of sanctity. Rules of governance became sacred law. The ordering of bishops, the handling of disputes, even the calculation of holy days were wrapped in divine authority. Yet beneath that holiness lay something more practical: control, uniformity, a faith that could be directed from the top down rather than scattered from the bottom up. Constantine must have smiled as these canons were read. To him, they were not only about theology, but about politics. A unified Easter meant unified citizens. A clear chain of authority meant fewer disputes to fracture the empire. By tying these administrative rules to the council's aura of holiness, he ensured they would carry weight far beyond the walls of Nicaea. Ordinary believers would never read the canons. Most would never even hear of them. But their lives would be shaped by them all the same, as the rhythm of the calendar shifted, as their bishops answered to higher authorities, as the empire's hand quietly pressed down through the guise of sacred order. The creed captured the headlines of history, but the canons were the fine print that secured power. They transformed Christianity from a loose network of communities into a structured institution, one that could march in step with the empire. And though they are seldom quoted, their impact is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. Administration cloaked forever in the robes of sanctity. Long before the Council of Nicaea, the celebration of Easter was a patchwork quilt. In some places it was tied to the Jewish Passover. In others it was held on different Sundays. And in many communities it followed local customs passed down from their earliest teachers. Believers celebrated the same story, but not on the same day. To a distant emperor, this may have seemed like a small issue, but to Constantine it was a glaring fracture. A divided calendar meant a divided people, and in an empire already stretched thin, division was dangerous. If the empire was to have one heartbeat, even the calendar had to be tamed. The bishops gathered in Nicaea were ordered to fix the date once and for all. It was not only about worship, it was about synchronization. Imagine tens of thousands of Christians across the empire rising at dawn on the same day, breaking bread, lighting candles, and proclaiming the resurrection. To Constantine, this was more than ritual. It was political theatre, a unison chorus that would echo from Britain to Egypt, binding scattered provinces into one empire under one god. The decision was made that Easter would no longer drift with local tradition. It would be calculated in a uniform way, tied to the spring equinox and the cycles of the moon, but controlled by the church, not by Jewish timekeeping. This separation was deliberate. Christianity was to have its own calendar, its own rhythm, and by extension, its own power. Time itself would be stamped with Christian authority, and because Constantine backed it, imperial authority as well. Think of what this meant. The measurement of time, something as simple as a date on the calendar, became an instrument of power. To follow Easter, as Nicaea decreed, was to show loyalty to the empire's chosen faith. To resist was to be marked as rebellious, as heretical, as outside the unity Constantine demanded. Ordinary people may not have realized the political weight of the change, but they lived it every year. Festivals, markets, pilgrimages, even family gatherings bent around the new rhythm of Easter, a rhythm set not by local tradition, but by imperial decree. The power of the calendar cannot be underestimated. Whoever controls the calendar controls memory. The empire now dictated when people would celebrate, when they would fast, when they would rest, and when they would work. It was a subtle chain, but one far stronger than iron. Soldiers can conquer land, but calendars conquer minds. With a single decision, Constantine and the bishops turned the resurrection from a varied remembrance into a synchronized drumbeat that marched the entire empire in step. From that point on, Easter was no longer only about faith. It was about unity, about proving who belonged to the body of the empire and who did not. The standardization of Easter was a quiet victory, easily overlooked in history books. yet it shows how power works, not only through battles or decrees, but through the silent shaping of time itself. When the clock of heaven was made to tick in rhythm with the clock of Rome, the empire's spiritual heartbeat became imperial forever. There is a legend that still drifts through popular imagination, that at the Council of Nicaea the bishops gathered around a long table and decided which books belonged in the Bible, casting votes or letting scrolls fall to the floor while divine hands guided the result. It is a dramatic story, simple and cinematic, but it is not true. The reality is far more complicated, stretched across centuries, shaped by rivalries, politics, and debates that began long before Constantine summoned his bishops to Nicaea. What was not on the table at that council was the Bible itself, yet the choices made there would still shape the taste, the tone, and the gatekeepers who would one day finalize the canon. By the time Nicaea convened in the year 325, communities across the empire were already reading different collections of texts. Some treasured the four Gospels we know today: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Others held close the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. Some used letters of Paul, while others had writings attributed to apostles that never made it into the final canon. To believers in distant towns, these texts were not heresy. They were scripture, the voices of their faith. Yet the empire had no single standard, and that very diversity was a threat to unity. The council did not settle the canon in one night, but it did something just as significant. By affirming the creed and by condemning certain teachings as heresy, it drew invisible boundaries around what was acceptable and what was not. Once Arius was branded a heretic, his followers and their texts were treated with suspicion. Once homoousios was declared truth, writings that supported alternative views were quietly pushed aside. The council did not pick the Bible, but it narrowed the field of voices that could survive long enough to be chosen later. In the decades and centuries that followed, bishops and church leaders leaned on the spirit of Nicaea to guide their decisions. Councils and synods debated which texts were authoritative, which were edifying, and which were dangerous. The process was messy, uneven, and filled with regional disagreements. One church might still read the Shepherd of Hermas as scripture, while another ignored it completely. The Book of Revelation was embraced in some places and rejected in others. Yet slowly, the boundaries tightened, and the shadow of Nicaea lingered over every decision. Constantine had not asked the bishops to define the Bible, but his call for unity had set the tone. Diversity was no longer a strength, it was a liability. The church that survived the council was one that valued harmony over variety, orthodoxy over freedom. In this climate, the canon could not be an open field of voices. It had to be a carefully pruned garden tended by the gatekeepers who now held imperial favour. So, while the Council of Nicaea did not slam the door shut on alternative gospels in a single night, it built the frame that the door would one day rest upon. The canon of Scripture, finalised over the next centuries, was born not in sudden drama, but in a slow narrowing. And at the heart of that narrowing was the council that taught the Church and the Empire that truth could be decided by vote, by power, and by silence. Long before the Bible took its final shape, countless texts circulated among Christian communities. Scrolls and codices carried words of wisdom, parables, and teachings that never reached the altar of orthodoxy. Among them were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Philip, each offering a glimpse into a Christianity far more diverse than what later emperors and bishops would allow. These writings were not mistakes or forgeries. They were streams of thought, voices of early believers who wrestled with faith in ways that the Council at Nicaea would one day deem unacceptable. The Gospel of Thomas contained sayings of Jesus, unlike those familiar to modern readers. It encouraged personal insight and reflection, urging believers to seek knowledge within themselves rather than relying on external authority. To the bishops of Nicaea, such a text was dangerous. Faith was meant to unite, not to encourage private interpretation. The Gospel of Mary elevated a woman as a central teacher and leader, challenging the patriarchal structures that were solidifying in the early church. The Gospel of Philip explored the mystical nature of the sacraments and the connection between the divine and human love. These were not minor texts. They represented entire approaches to belief, entire visions of the relationship between God and humanity. When the council met in 325, these texts were not officially burned or erased, but they were marked as untrustworthy. They were labelled apocrypha, a word that did not necessarily mean false, but that meant forbidden from public reading in worship, and eventually denied access to most believers. Without official support, and with few patrons able to protect them, the scrolls began to disappear. Monks copied what the council approved, while other writings were left to decay or lost in the sands of forgotten libraries. Their ideas faded, not from lack of merit, but because the machinery of orthodoxy had chosen what to preserve. Over the following centuries, these texts survived only in secret, hidden in remote monasteries, or buried in caves like the Dead Sea Scrolls of Christianity. Occasionally, a fragment would resurface, a reminder that what we think we know about the early church is only a fraction of the truth. Scholars, who later discovered the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, revealed entire collections of these voices that had been silenced for over 1,000 years. Each manuscript was a window into a world where Christianity was not yet uniform, where belief could be personal, mystical, and radically inclusive. The silencing of these texts was not accidental. It was part of a deliberate shaping of memory and authority. By allowing only certain writings to flourish, the Church created a singular narrative, a story that emphasized unity and obedience over curiosity and debate. The streams of thought represented by Thomas, Mary, and Philip dimmed not because they lacked insight or inspiration, but because power determined which voices would be heard and which would be silenced. What survives today is only what the council and the gatekeepers allowed, and in the shadows, the lost texts remind us that history is never the whole story. Inside the quiet walls of monasteries, long after the Council of Nicaea had closed, another kind of council continued, one without emperors or bishops, but no less powerful. Scribes sat in cold rooms, lit only by flickering oil lamps, quills in hand, copying scrolls and codices with painstaking care. These scriptoria were not just workshops. They were gatekeepers of memory, the places where the past was preserved or allowed to fade into silence. What survived and what vanished often depended not on the value of the text, but on whether it fit the theological lens imposed by the Church. Imagine a young monk in the year 350, seated at a wooden desk, ink barely dry on one page as he lifts another scroll. On it are words that might challenge what he has been taught about Christ, about God, or about the structure of the Church itself. He must choose carefully. To copy it is to risk the ire of superiors. To ignore it is to let the world forget it entirely. Every stroke of the quill is a decision that will ripple across generations. Texts approved for copying will live on. Those ignored or rejected will disappear, sometimes forever. In these rooms, theology was the filter through which history passed. Mathematical treatises, philosophical arguments, and alternative gospels were examined not only for their content, but for their compatibility with orthodoxy. If a work praised a teacher or idea deemed heretical, it might be left unrecopied. If it contained a story that contradicted the creed, its survival became precarious. Over time, the surviving manuscripts presented a narrowed view of the past, one carefully shaped to reflect the beliefs the Church wanted preserved. Memory itself became selective, and the act of copying became an act of authority. The scriptorium also served as a classroom. Novice monks learned not only how to write letters and illuminate margins, but how to judge content. What was worth saving? What could safely be shared? The answers were taught as part of obedience. faithful repetition ensured that the next generation of scribes internalized the boundaries of permissible knowledge. What began as devotion to the written word slowly became devotion to the approved version of truth. Consider the scale. Hundreds of monasteries across the empire, each with its own scriptorium, each contributing to the gradual shaping of what would be remembered. A text might survive in one location, lost in another, and eventually only the copies that aligned with the creed remained to be discovered centuries later. The lost knowledge was not destroyed by accident. It was allowed to fade quietly, systematically, almost invisibly. In these rooms, history was moulded without debate, without bloodshed, yet with power as absolute as any emperor's. Theology became the lens, the quill became the instrument, and the monks became both guardians and judges. What we now read from early Christian texts is filtered through their hands, their choices, and their obedience. The stories they did not copy, the teachings they quietly ignored, remain in shadow. And in those shadows lie questions about what was once possible and what was deliberately forgotten. What begins as a suggestion from the emperor can grow into something far more powerful than any one man intended. In the wake of Nicaea, Constantine's support of a unified Christianity was more than policy. It planted seeds for enforcement that would stretch across centuries. At first, disagreements were settled by persuasion, by the prestige of bishops, or by the authority of an emperor who claimed divine guidance. But, as time passed, the structures became more rigid. Synods and councils met to enforce orthodoxy. Edicts were written, specifying not only what was true, but what must be obeyed. By the mid-4th century, the Church had begun to formalize its mechanisms of discipline. Bishops wrote letters threatening excommunication for those who persisted in what was deemed heresy. Communities could be ostracized for continuing to read texts that had been quietly marked as unacceptable. These early edicts were the first step in a long evolution, one that transformed the Church from a network of scattered believers into an institution capable of controlling belief across an entire empire. The stakes were high. Early Christians still remembered the days of persecution, when speaking the wrong words could mean imprisonment or death. The shift from imperial preference to organized enforcement meant that now the danger came not only from emperors, but from fellow believers who enforced the rules with vigilance. Orthodoxy was no longer simply an ideal. It was a standard backed by authority, and authority required compliance. As centuries passed, these mechanisms became more sophisticated. Courts of orthodoxy emerged, formal tribunals where heresy could be tried, often without the protections we associate with justice today. Witnesses could be questioned, books could be seized, and punishments meted out that ranged from exile to imprisonment. The tools were legal, administrative, and spiritual all at once. Belief itself became a territory mapped by law, and the Church was the cartographer. Consider the reach of these systems. A monk in northern Gaul could be investigated for teaching ideas that aligned with Arius. A bishop in Spain could face charges for allowing the reading of a forbidden text. Messages travelled slowly, but the network was thorough. Edicts and rulings were copied and sent to distant corners of the empire, ensuring that the shadow of Nicaea and subsequent councils fell on every Christian community. Compliance became not only expected, but necessary for survival. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, the pattern was firmly established. What began as imperial preference had matured into an intricate web of enforcement, with synods, edicts, and courts of orthodoxy acting as the backbone of a system designed to preserve unity at all costs. Faith became inseparable from obedience. History, texts, and ideas were filtered through these structures. The long shadow of Nicaea stretched beyond theology into governance, law, and even daily life, ensuring that the version of Christianity that emerged was tightly controlled, consistent, and sanctioned by both church and state. Athanasius of Alexandria lived a life that reads like a map of power in motion. Born in the late 3rd century, he rose to prominence as a young bishop, during a time when Christianity was no longer just a persecuted faith, but a political instrument. Athanasius became the fiercest defender of the Nicene Creed, the man who would argue that the Son was co-eternal with the Father. Yet defending orthodoxy was not a simple matter of belief. It was a dangerous game, one that involved exile, recall, and exile again. Each decision to support or oppose him carried consequences that stretched beyond theology into politics, empire, and empire's image of itself. Exiled for the first time in 330, Athanasius left Alexandria under the orders of a rival faction. His enemies claimed he had overstepped his authority, stirring conflict between bishops. Yet beneath the surface, the battle was about more than one man's behaviour. Athanasius represented a vision of orthodoxy that some emperors found inconvenient. To support or oppose him was to signal loyalty not only to the creed, but to the shifting alliances of imperial power. His exile demonstrated that orthodoxy was not a fixed truth, but a mechanism with levers, pushed and pulled by emperors, bishops, and court politics. He returned, only to be exiled again a few years later. Each return was accompanied by celebration in Alexandria, each departure by mourning. To the people, he was a hero, a defender of true faith. To the empire, he was a political variable, one whose presence or absence could tilt the balance of power in fragile regions. Orthodoxy, in this sense, was a machine. It did not operate in the abstract. It required enforcement, timing, and management of personalities, all of which were wielded like tools by those who held authority. Athanasius's life shows the human cost of this political machinery. Friendships were tested, communities divided, and the very meaning of faith became entangled with survival. Supporters who defied imperial edicts risked exile themselves. Opponents who aligned with shifting court factions could see their power rise and fall with the emperor's favour. Each decision about doctrine was inseparable from the calculus of power. Orthodoxy was enforced through letters, councils, and edicts, and every action left a trail of winners and losers. By the time Athanasius died in 372, he had been exiled 5 times, survived countless plots, and remained the champion of the Nicene Creed. His life is a testament to the way theology and politics were fused in the early church. Orthodoxy was not a simple statement of belief. It was a living system, a machine with levers moved by men who understood that faith could unify an empire, fracture it, or reshape it entirely. Athanasius shows us that the line between heresy and orthodoxy was never purely spiritual. It was a tool of power, exercised with precision and sometimes cruelty, and one whose effects would echo across centuries. Throughout history, knowledge has always had 2 faces. One is preservation, a careful keeping of what is valuable. The other is possession, a control of what others may see. From the grand imperial libraries of Rome to the hidden rooms of later monastic complexes, whispers tell of collections that were never meant to be shared. Scrolls were gathered, codices copied, and texts stored behind doors that few were allowed to enter. Some were preserved out of love for wisdom. Others were withheld to control what the world would remember. Imagine the libraries of Constantinople in the 4th century, where copies of Greek and Roman works sat on shelves, dust settling quietly over their pages. Scholars could read them, study them, and learn. But as the empire faltered and power shifted, these texts were moved, hidden, or placed under the watch of a few men deemed worthy. Each decision was a statement. Knowledge could be kept, or it could be made invisible. The stories of what had been discovered, debated, or understood could vanish simply because someone chose not to copy them or allow them to be read. Later, as Christianity became the dominant force in Europe, this pattern continued. Monks, bishops, and eventually the Vatican accumulated vast collections of manuscripts. Some were religious texts, others philosophical, historical, or scientific. They were stored in rooms barred to outsiders, catalogued in lists only insiders could read, and carefully guarded. Few scholars were allowed access, and even fewer could copy the texts. In the shadow of these walls, centuries of knowledge quietly waited. Some historians call it preservation, others call it possession. The line between the two is thin and often invisible. Consider the implications. A single text, preserved but unseen, might contain alternative teachings, lost histories, or methods of thought that could change how we understand the past. A work on medicine, astronomy, or mathematics might have survived the fall of Rome, only to be hidden where no scholar could consult it. In those quiet rooms, knowledge existed, yet it might as well have been lost. To the world outside, the record appeared incomplete, fractured, and obedient to the narrative that power wished to enforce. Even today, the echoes of these hidden libraries remain. The Vatican's secret archive, the archives of monasteries across Europe, and private collections untouched by time hold thousands of documents no one can freely examine. Maps, manuscripts, and scrolls lie on shelves in silence, invisible to the scholars and curious minds who might rewrite history if they were allowed access. Preservation and possession coexist in these spaces. What survives is filtered not just by time, but by decisions made long ago about who could see, who could copy, and who would be allowed to remember. The libraries we never read are reminders that history is not only what happened, it is also what someone allowed us to see. In the shadows of stone walls and locked doors, the story of knowledge itself is written in silence. Every unopened codex is a question, every hidden scroll a challenge. What truths have been preserved for power rather than enlightenment? And what would we know today if the world had been allowed to read them? In the earliest days of Christianity, women were not only present, they were leaders, teachers, and witnesses to the life of Jesus. Mary Magdalene appears in texts now called apocryphal as more than a follower. She is depicted as a teacher, a confidant, and a central figure in the passing of secret knowledge. Communities recognized deaconesses who guided rituals, cared for the sick, and instructed believers. Their roles were vital, yet, over time, the stories of their influence faded, leaving gaps in the historical record that we can only glimpse through fragments and whispers of texts once widely read. The process of silencing was gradual. As councils like Nicaea and subsequent synods defined orthodoxy, they also shaped the social structures of the Church. Authority became increasingly male, concentrated in bishops and priests. Texts emphasizing female leadership were marginalized or ignored. Stories of women teaching, prophesying, or guiding communities were removed from public reading. Mary Magdalene's voice, so prominent in some Gospels, was overshadowed by a narrative that emphasized the 12 male apostles. In doing so, the Church created a selective memory, one where male authority was normal and female authority invisible. Consider the early communities scattered across the Mediterranean. In Antioch, Corinth, and Rome, women served as deaconesses, catechists, and hosts of house churches. They were integral to the organization of worship, the care of the poor, and the teaching of doctrine. Their leadership was practical, spiritual, and recognized by peers. But as institutional power centralized, the same roles that once carried influence were reduced. Deaconesses were limited to minor tasks. Teaching became the domain of men, and their stories in Scripture were edited or left unrecorded. The texts that survived reinforced this shift. Male-centered narratives were preserved and copied in monastic scriptoria. Scrolls that suggested equal or prominent roles for women were left uncopied or hidden in remote collections. Over time, a pattern emerged. What could be remembered was filtered through male authority. The voices of women, even when present in sacred texts, were muffled or removed entirely. Historians today have to read between the lines, reconstructing lost contributions from scattered references and the few surviving apocryphal texts. Mary Magdalene's story illustrates this clearly. In the Gospel of Mary, she instructs and comforts other disciples, offering insight into the teachings of Jesus that men initially do not understand. In the Gospel of Philip, she is described as a companion with authority, someone whose insight surpasses others. Yet these Gospels were not included in the official canon. The influence of her voice was diminished, her authority questioned, and her role minimized in later retellings. The vanishing of women's voices in early Christianity was not accidental. It reflected the consolidation of power, the shaping of orthodoxy, and the desire to create a clear hierarchy. Authority became male by design, and memory was sculpted to fit that vision. What remains today is a shadow of the full story, a reminder that history is often written by those who control who may speak and who must vanish. The women who once guided communities continue to whisper from the margins, challenging us to ask what was lost and why it mattered. Language is more than a tool for communication. It is a gate, a filter, and sometimes a lock. In the early centuries of Christianity, the words used to convey belief determined not only what could be said, but who could understand it. The first followers spoke in Koine Greek, a language accessible across much of the Eastern Mediterranean. Scriptures, letters, and teachings were written in this common tongue, and while interpretation varied, communities could engage directly with the words. Meaning was negotiable, open to discussion, and alive with nuance. But as Christianity spread westward, Latin began to dominate. Jerome's translation, the Vulgate, became the standard text in the late 4th century. Latin was not merely a translation of words, it was a transformation of meaning. Subtle shifts in vocabulary could alter theological nuances. Terms that once allowed debate became fixed. Concepts that had flexibility in Greek were now framed in the rigid structures of Latin, often leaving out the ambiguity that had fueled rich discussion. Words became tools of authority, dictating not only what doctrine said, but what could be asked, thought, or explored. The laity, for most of the Middle Ages, rarely read Latin. They heard sermons, listened to prayers, and absorbed doctrines second-hand. The language barrier itself became a form of control. Knowledge was filtered through priests, monks, and scholars who not only understood Latin, but could also interpret it in ways that reinforced orthodoxy. The same text could be read in multiple ways by those who knew Greek, but in Latin, interpretation was narrowed. What the laity could hear and understand was predetermined by the linguistic choices of translators and teachers. By the scholastic period, Latin had evolved even further. The language of theology became highly technical, filled with terms that carried precise, often exclusive, meanings. Words like homoousios or consubstantialis were no longer casual philosophical ideas, but carefully guarded markers of orthodoxy. Only those trained in the schools of cathedral chapters or universities could navigate these texts safely. For ordinary believers, comprehension was impossible. Faith was experienced, not understood, and authority rested firmly in the hands of those fluent in the sacred tongue. The effect of this language lock was profound. Ideas that had flourished in Greek became simplified, redefined, or even lost in translation. Concepts that allowed inquiry and questioning were replaced with terms that demanded assent. Theology became not just a study of God, but a coded system, one that required initiation to enter. The words themselves enforced hierarchy. Knowledge was no longer widely accessible. Meaning was curated, preserved, and controlled. When we read the Vulgate today, we may forget that every word choice shaped belief, limited debate, and defined who had access to truth. The language of the Church created a subtle but powerful control over memory and thought. What could be said, what could be questioned, and what could be taught depended not only on authority, but on the words themselves. In this way, language became a lock on understanding, and Latin the key held by the educated few. The image of fire has long been associated with destruction, with books thrown into flames as symbols of heresy and disobedience. Public burnings were dramatic, terrifying, and effective, a warning to anyone who might question the approved teachings. Yet these fiery spectacles were only part of the story. The quieter, less visible methods of erasing knowledge were often more powerful. A text could die simply by not being copied. In the scriptorium, the absence of a hand tracing letters was as lethal as a torch, for what was not recopied slowly faded into oblivion. Imagine a monk in the year 450, sitting in a draughty room with scrolls spread before him. Some texts are commanded to be copied, while others are ignored. Each time he chooses one over another, he is deciding what will survive and what will vanish. A work not copied will rot, its words lost to time. In the centuries before printing, survival depended entirely on repetition, on the care and diligence of scribes. No copy, no future. The quiet death of texts went unnoticed by most, yet it reshaped history. Public condemnations added another layer. Authors, teachers, and thinkers were declared heretics in synods and councils, their writings forbidden. Some works were collected and destroyed, burned in town squares, their ashes scattered as a warning. But the mere declaration of heresy often sufficed. Once a text was condemned, few dared to copy it. Fear ensured compliance. Books that might have been preserved for generations were left to decay in storage rooms, corners of monasteries, or private collections. Oblivion became practical, invisible, and irreversible. The combination of visible and invisible methods created a powerful control over memory. Fire erased the immediate threat, while silence ensured that the ideas could not rise again. A text that survived one generation could be lost to the next if no hand traced its words anew. Scholars, priests, and monks acted as both guardians and censors, deciding which knowledge could enter the collective memory and which would vanish forever. In this way, history itself was curated, with gaps appearing not because events or ideas never existed, but because they were never recorded again. Even texts that survived in fragments reveal the danger of this quiet erasure. Ancient Gospels, treatises on philosophy, letters of early Christian leaders, and works of science that contradict the official narrative often remain incomplete. The portions that exist are snapshots, hints of a wider conversation that has been largely silenced. Fire was dramatic and terrifying, but the absence of repetition, the denial of copying, was just as lethal and far less visible to the eyes of future generations. In the end, history remembers what is preserved and forgets what is ignored. The story of early Christianity shows that oblivion often looks like no copy available. What we cannot read has shaped our understanding of faith, power, and knowledge as much as what survived. Fire may have been the spectacle, but silence and neglect were the true footnotes, quietly shaping the record that reaches us today. In the centuries after Nicaea, the Nicene Creed was no longer confined to the walls of churches or council halls. It spilled into the streets, the fields, and the battlefields of Europe. Goths and Vandals, tribes once considered barbarian by the empire, adopted Christianity, but not the version sanctioned in Constantinople. They followed Arian beliefs, teaching that the Son was created and not co-eternal with the Father. This theological difference, which might seem abstract today, became a reason for war, alliances, and conquest. Creed lines became front lines, and belief was inseparable from politics. Imagine a soldier in the year 475 standing on the edge of a Vandal encampment. He is not only fighting for land or spoils, but for the version of faith he has been taught is true. His enemy prays differently, recites different creeds, and celebrates Easter on a different day. The stakes are spiritual as well as temporal. A victory on the battlefield meant more than power over territory. It was proof that God favoured one interpretation over another, that orthodoxy would survive and heresy would fall. Imperial theologians travelled with armies, advising generals, preaching to soldiers, and interpreting victories as signs of divine favour. Letters and treatises were copied and distributed to affirm the righteousness of the Nicene position. Meanwhile, Arian bishops sought to inspire their followers, emphasizing their own understanding of Scripture and Christ. Across kingdoms, belief became a banner under which men fought, died, and conquered. Victory was measured not only in land, but in who survived to teach, to worship, and to pass down the creed to the next generation. The clash between Arian and Nicene kingdoms demonstrates the power of words. A single Greek term, homoousios, had transformed from a theological debate into a symbol worth defending with swords. Soldiers who could not define it understood its importance intuitively. It dictated loyalty, allegiance, and identity. To side with the Nicene or Arian creed was to choose a place in the social and political hierarchy of the emerging European world. Faith and empire became inseparable, and the line between spiritual truth and political strategy blurred. Even after battles ended, the influence of creed on governance remained. Nicene victories reinforced the authority of emperors who promoted orthodoxy, while Arian kingdoms struggled to maintain cohesion. Populations were sometimes compelled to convert, churches rebuilt or repurposed, and dissenters silenced. By tying belief to power, the Nicene Creed extended its reach far beyond doctrine into law, education, and daily life. The story of the Creed on the battlefield reminds us that theology is not just a matter of private conscience. It can shape empires, ignite wars, and determine who thrives and who is erased from history. The Nicene and Arian divisions are proof that ideas, carefully codified in councils, can become as powerful as armies, and that belief itself can be wielded as a weapon, shaping the map of Europe for centuries to come. From the flicker of candlelight in medieval churches to the printed pages of 19th century textbooks, the story of the Council of Nicaea has been told and retold until it became larger than history itself. Preachers described bishops in dramatic terms, emphasizing the grandeur of the emperor, the passion of debate, and the triumph of orthodoxy. For congregations, these sermons were the first cinema of the mind, where imagination filled in the details and the lines between fact, legend, and interpretation blurred. What the audience remembered was not always what had happened, but what had been emphasized, repeated, and dramatized. By the time textbooks appeared in Europe during the Industrial Age, the narrative of Nicaea had been streamlined. Students read of Arius, Athanasius, and Constantine as figures locked in a moral drama, with the council depicted as a decisive moment of triumph for the true faith. Complexities, dissenting voices, and the slow evolution of canon formation were simplified or erased. The story presented a neat chronology, easy to memorize and repeat, and the council became a symbol of order imposed on chaos. Textbooks did not merely record history, they shaped it, embedding in young minds a version of the past that felt inevitable and complete. In modern times, film and television have added a new layer to the myth-making. Directors stage councils in grand halls, bishops clash with raised voices, and emperors gesture with decisive authority. The language, lighting, and music guide the audience to feel tension, urgency, and triumph. Yet these depictions are rarely concerned with accuracy. Instead, they create an emotional truth, a version of history that feels immediate and believable. People come to know the council not from manuscripts or archival research, but from what they have seen in these cinematic interpretations. Memory becomes imagination, and imagination becomes fact. The power of repetition across centuries is remarkable. When sermons, textbooks, and films all emphasize similar motifs, the drama of debate, the clarity of orthodoxy, the moral heroism of certain figures, audiences internalize them as reality. What began as events shaped by politics, theology, and human personalities becomes a mythic narrative, where every line and gesture is charged with symbolic meaning. In this process, the nuance of historical context is lost, and the lived experiences of thousands of believers, dissenters, and scribes are reduced to props and backstory. Yet the myth serves a purpose. By standardizing the story of Nicaea, authority, both religious and cultural, reinforces the lessons it wishes to impart: the importance of unity, the triumph of orthodoxy, and the consequences of dissent. The council becomes more than history. It is a template, a mental stage where viewers and readers learn not only about the past, but about the rules of belief and power that continue to shape societies. Cinema of the mind is powerful because it bypasses critical analysis. It appeals to emotion and memory, embedding a version of events that feels concrete, even if it is constructed. Over centuries, the Council of Nicaea has travelled from spoken word to printed page to moving image, and each time, the story has grown more cohesive, more dramatic, and more authoritative. Myth and memory have merged, leaving us with a past that is part history, part imagination, and entirely influential in shaping how we understand faith, power, and human decision-making. History has a way of refusing to stay silent. Centuries after texts were hidden, lost, or ignored, fragments began to reappear, challenging the neat narrative that had dominated schools, sermons, and textbooks. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 in Upper Egypt sent shockwaves through the study of early Christianity. Codices, buried in the sands for nearly 15 centuries, contained gospels, letters, and philosophical treatises that offered perspectives entirely absent from the canonical Bible. Some emphasized personal enlightenment, some elevated figures like Mary Magdalene, and some proposed teachings that questioned hierarchical authority. These fragments were messages in bottles, washed ashore across time, insisting that history was far more complex than previously understood. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 near Qumran, added another layer. Though primarily Jewish in content, they revealed practices, interpretations, and textual variations that forced scholars to reconsider the development of religious thought in the first centuries. Texts once considered uniform were suddenly revealed to be diverse, fluid, and evolving. When read alongside Nag Hammadi and other manuscripts, a picture emerged of early Christianity and Judaism as living, dynamic traditions rather than fixed systems. The official narrative, long presented as linear and authoritative, now appeared incomplete. Oxyrhynchus, a city in Egypt whose sands preserved papyri for centuries, revealed an astonishing breadth of documents. Letters, poems, fragments of gospels, and civic records emerged, demonstrating the variety of texts in circulation. Ordinary people, not only clerics or emperors, had access to a world of writing that modern narratives had ignored. The fragments reminded scholars that control over what was copied, preserved, or forgotten was not absolute. Knowledge could vanish, but could also resurface unexpectedly, like a seed lying dormant beneath layers of soil. These rediscoveries disrupted assumptions. The council decisions, the canon, the censored texts, all were recontextualized. Scholars had to confront the fact that early Christianity was not a monolith, but a network of ideas, competing interpretations, and debates that persisted for centuries. Texts once dismissed as heretical were suddenly recognized as vital pieces of the puzzle, demonstrating the intellectual and spiritual richness of communities erased or silenced by power. Yet, rediscovery was not always welcomed. Many of these manuscripts contradicted familiar teachings and unsettled institutions that relied on a consistent narrative. Scholars had to navigate political, religious, and academic pressures while interpreting texts that had survived by chance. Each fragment, no matter how small, had the power to shift understanding, to rewrite the story of who believed what, when, and why. In the end, The Nag Hammadi Library, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Oxyrhynchus Papyri remind us that history is never fully lost. It may be buried, hidden, or ignored, but it can always resurface, complicating authority and demanding that we rethink what we thought we knew. The pursuit of truth has never been a quiet path. From the Renaissance onward, scholars emerged who refused to accept the narrative handed down through centuries. Humanists in the 1500s examined manuscripts in Italian and French libraries, seeking the original texts behind translations, annotations, and edits. They pried at the seams of history, comparing copies, questioning interpretations, and tracing sources. Their work often revealed inconsistencies, variations, and omissions that suggested history had been curated with care and purpose. These early investigators were celebrated in some circles for reviving classical knowledge, but they were also sidelined, criticized, and sometimes accused of disturbing sacred authority. In the 17th century, historians continued the search. They examined letters, council records, and codices preserved in monasteries. Scholars like Jean Mabillon in France developed rigorous methods for dating manuscripts and verifying authenticity. Each discovery challenged the established order. They showed that what had been considered a single, unified tradition was instead a collection of competing voices. Errors, omissions, and contradictions were not accidental. They were part of the process of centralizing power, establishing orthodoxy, and controlling collective memory. Those who asked questions too persistently risked professional isolation, funding cuts, or public censure. The Enlightenment and 19th century brought new tools and new motives. Historians trained in universities applied critical analysis, comparing sources across languages, regions, and centuries. They examined the formation of the canon, the decisions of councils like Nicaea, and the disappearance of alternative gospels. Their work revealed patterns of suppression, selective preservation, and editorial influence that had long been invisible to casual readers. Some scholars were praised for their insight, while others were labelled controversial, eccentric, or even dangerous. Asking again, challenging the accepted story, was a path lined with risk. In the 20th century, rediscoveries like the Nag Hammadi Library and the Dead Sea Scrolls invigorated the work of historians. These fragments forced researchers to rethink assumptions about early Christianity, the diversity of beliefs, and the mechanisms of suppression. Those willing to follow the evidence, even when it contradicted long-held narratives, sometimes faced institutional pushback, skepticism, or professional marginalization. Yet their persistence expanded the boundaries of knowledge, demonstrating that history is not fixed, but a dialogue between what survives, what is discovered, and what scholars dare to ask. The common thread across centuries is courage. Scholars who pry at the seams, who question the official account, and who trace forgotten texts demonstrate that history is not merely a record. It is a process, shaped by those who preserve it and challenged by those who refuse to accept it uncritically. Each generation of investigators asks again, often uncovering truths that institutions may prefer remain hidden. They remind us that the past is never fully known, that silence is not absence, and that the work of the scholar is both illumination and rebellion. Their legacy is a reminder that history belongs not only to those in power, but also to those who dare to ask the questions others avoided for centuries. If the first centuries of Christianity were a forest, it was dense, tangled, and alive with voices speaking in different keys. There were communities that interpreted teachings through personal reflection, others that followed local leaders, and some that embraced mystical or symbolic readings of Scripture. The forest was full of light and shadow, ideas that flourished side by side, and disagreements that were natural rather than threatening. Yet, over time, a single path was marked, narrow and straight, guiding believers in one direction and discouraging deviation. Who drew that path, and why, remains a question that history only partially answers. The questions that were forbidden were not always forbidden because they were false. They were forbidden because they were ungovernable. Ideas that could not be easily contained within a hierarchy threatened authority. Texts that encouraged independent thought, that suggested alternative roles for women, or that offered mystical interpretations of Christ, were all inconvenient. They existed outside the control of councils, emperors, and later institutionalized churches. To allow these ideas to circulate freely would be to surrender influence, to risk confusion, and to challenge the carefully curated narrative of orthodoxy. Consider the apocryphal Gospels. They offered perspectives on Jesus, his teachings, and the nature of salvation that did not align neatly with the Nicene Creed. Some portrayed Mary Magdalene as a leader among the disciples. Others emphasized inner knowledge over external ritual. These texts were not deemed heretical for lack of wisdom or spiritual insight, but because they could not be easily managed, copied, or explained within the emerging power structures of the Church. The forest of early faith was pruned, paths were cleared, and certain branches were allowed to grow while others were cut away. Even beyond texts, forbidden questions applied to practice, leadership, and belief. Who could teach? Who could interpret? Who could serve as a guide? The answers were increasingly restricted, and communities were pressured to conform. Disobedience was dangerous, not only socially but spiritually. Heresy, whether in thought or action, was punished. Silence became as important as speech, obedience as essential as devotion. Over centuries, the cumulative effect was the narrowing of human experience, a funneling of diversity into a single, authorized pathway. Yet the questions persist. When scholars rediscover forgotten texts, fragments, or alternative interpretations, they reopen the forest, showing us that the first faith was far more complex than we had been taught. The forbidden questions remind us that history is not a fixed trail. It is shaped by what was preserved, what was ignored, and what authorities deemed acceptable. By asking again, we confront the choices that shaped belief, explore what was deliberately hidden, and imagine the possibilities that were silenced. These questions are dangerous not because they are untrue, but because they remind us that the first forest of faith was richer, wilder, and more human than the single path suggests. The Council of Nicaea did not end the story of Christianity. It marked a moment, a convergence of faith, power, and politics. But it was never a completion. The canon it influenced, the creeds it formalized, and the authority it reinforced were only parts of a larger, more complex picture. The past stretches beyond the walls of council halls, beyond the votes of bishops, and beyond the texts preserved or banned. It includes voices that were silenced, ideas that were sidelined, and questions that were forbidden. History is never tidy. It is alive, layered, and full of surprises waiting to be discovered. Even today, the margins of history remain rich with insight. Texts buried in monasteries, fragments found in desert sands, and writings preserved by chance remind us that what we have inherited is curated, filtered, and selective. The canon tells one story, but the margins tell another. They speak of diversity, debate, and the struggle for understanding in a world where power often dictates memory. Scholars who study these edges illuminate a past that is larger than the narrative of Nicaea, showing us a Christianity that was once vibrant, contested, and far more human than the neat versions preserved in textbooks. Reading the margins is an act of courage. It challenges assumptions, confronts authority, and invites questions that have been ignored for centuries. It reminds us that completion is an illusion. No council, no creed, no canon can fully contain the breadth of human belief, inquiry, or imagination. The work of understanding the past is ongoing, a dialogue between what was written, what was hidden, and what we choose to uncover. Every fragment discovered, every manuscript studied, every apocryphal text explored expands the story, revealing complexity, where once there appeared only certainty. The future belongs to those willing to ask, to read between the lines, and to seek beyond the official record. It belongs to the curious, the diligent, and the brave. By engaging with the margins, we do more than understand the past. We reclaim agency over memory, interpretation, and belief. We learn that history is not only what has survived, but also what has been hidden, ignored, or forgotten. Every question reopened, every text reconsidered, reshapes the narrative and deepens our understanding of faith, power, and human experience. The legacy of Nicaea is both instructive and cautionary. It shows the power of councils, creeds, and authority to shape belief, yet it also demonstrates the limits of that power. The past cannot be fully controlled, erased, or contained. Whispers of lost texts, rediscovered manuscripts, and alternative interpretations remind us that the story is larger than any single decision, that understanding is provisional, and that truth often resides in the spaces between what is written and what is silenced. Beyond Nicaea, the journey continues, and the margins remain open to those willing to read them.